Good evening. I'm, as you pointed out, with CBS News. Full disclosure up front, I haven't been to Afghanistan for several years, so the country I know, and I think the country that the panel will be discussing, are probably slightly different things. But let me introduce Hamid Karzai, the BBC, Nick Mayo of The Telegraph, and Bronwyn Maddox of The Times, all of whom have traveled in and have some deep background in Afghanistan and the area and all the factors that are going to come to play August 20th when we have the election. And what I thought I would do is just start with a question for each, perhaps, and then go from there and see how the evening goes. So, Amal, let me start with you. You are recently back. Is Karzai's election inevitable?
I don't think so. He can be one of the candidates that wins most votes, but according to the Afghan constitution, winner is the person who wins 50+1 vote. So I don't think he can win 50% vote this time around unless something magically happen from now till 20th of August. Most of the people inside Afghanistan are thinking that the election will go to the second round. According to the Afghan constitution, within 2 weeks, second round of election should happen. But this time around, even that is a bit difficult because the next day after the election, Ramadan or the fasting month starts in Afghanistan. So it will be very difficult to arrange second round of election then. So perhaps there will be some more delays, and then there will be second round of election. And during the second round of election, there are people like Dr. Abdullah and Dr. Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai who might give him a very, very tough time.
So as if Afghanistan needs more uncertainty, the election could just bring more uncertainty.
Well, you may say it that way, but if you speak to the supporters of Dr. Abdullah or Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai, and surprisingly most other candidates, they are all of the view that elections should go to the second round because all of them are thinking that in the first round it's impossible that they might win it. So most of them are hopeful that election will go to the second round, and hopefully for them they will do well.
Nick, from your traveling around, and on the premise that all politics is local, or are local, what have you heard from the people? Is the anger so deep that their roads are not paved and the schools are not built, that will be the deciding factor, or is it the Taliban and fear that's going to decide this, perhaps?
Well, I think people have been moaning about Karzai for as long as he's been in power, but who are the alternatives, really? I don't know whether the challenges are going to be strong enough and popular enough across the board and across all the different ethnic groups to take on Karzai. And he's got the advantage of incumbency, of course. All the police chiefs and governors back him, and politics in Afghanistan is to some extent about tribal votes and groups voting, and as you say, it's local. If people think they're going to get a new road, and those are the sorts of factors that people vote on. It does sound as if it's going to be a bit more of a competition than people thought. For a long time, everyone expected Karzai to walk this election, but now it seems that there might be a bit more of a challenge than people thought. And he is unpopular. I mean, people they grumble and grumble about Karzai, but at the end of the grumbling, they'll tell you that, well, they're still going to vote for him. I think the Taliban factor will be a very interesting one to watch. There were fears that this election couldn't happen because perhaps the Taliban would wreck it. That was the same thing in 2004, though, and that election went very smoothly. It's quite difficult for the Taliban to interfere with the election if people want to vote. They can't blow up polling stations with people inside. So I think it is actually going to be a very interesting election to watch. It could be a real competition this time. Did
something happen recently that it is not inevitably Karzai, that the other candidates are starting to get more attention, that it's not going to be a walk?
Well, I think Afghans just become more politically aware. I was there in 2004, and it was a walkover for Karzai. People voted for Karzai because he represented democracy and he represented peace and development and all the things that Afghans were desperate for. It was an incredibly optimistic time, actually. That election day in Kandahar was very peaceful. There was a sort of carnival atmosphere. People wanted to vote. They thought that they were voting for their future. I'm not sure it's going to be like that this time.
A couple of things that occur, but let me go to Bronwyn. And I was reading something you wrote, actually I think it was from last year, but about the role of NATO, that the U.S. Has the right to ask NATO to do more, and this is actually a little broader than the election itself. But what is the role of NATO now? I mean, the U.S., the U.K. are bearing the brunt of the casualties. U.K. public opinion is starting to wane a bit. Where is the military in this, and what role are they going to play on the 20th?
Interesting. I mean, a lot of what I've been doing in the run-up to these elections is talking to the American and British and Danes and so on, but they're the linchpins of NATO, if you like. And they're not sure. I mean, the Americans clearly are taking the brunt of it and are going to take more of the burden in the future. I think there's no real way to escape that conclusion. The debate within America doesn't seem to me where it is in Britain at the moment. But in Britain, you have this very acute questioning of what are we doing there? We had Bill Rammell, the Armed Forces Minister, just on Monday, defining the mission down about as tightly as it's ever been defined down. Say, we're there to defeat al-Qaeda and prevent al-Qaeda terrorism on British soil, that's it. And yes, all right, you've got a few development goals, DFID fluttering around, if you give me around the edge of that. But that's about as narrow as we've had a definition of the mission. What they're immediately trying to do is get through these elections. But again, then you've got a debate about, well, what constitutes success in these elections. And it's very hard to get any official or minister to say at the moment what actually is going to amount to success. How do you define it? How many stolen votes is acceptable? How much fraud is acceptable? How many deaths are acceptable before you have to say this didn't go too well? The Americans have taken a simpler line, it seems to me. Even though the Obama administration is very deliberately thoughtful about it, they have thrown themselves behind Karzai. Not so much that they couldn't change if someone else does turn out to win, but again, they're not needled by the kind of public debate we've got here. So you've got a very messy situation within the main NATO sort of components there. And I think in a way the role is going to be defined when we get the other side of the elections. People will then see what we've got.
Which raises, I guess, the big broad question. I mean, how long can NATO, each country sustain their military presence? And is all the money being thrown in militarily the answer? Or is it roads and schools and hospitals? And who of all of these candidates is going to be the one who can deal on that level with the Western powers and on the local level? Do you think any of them, from what you're seeing, have those abilities?
No single person who's going to be an easy answer to that. And there isn't a simple answer to that. Obviously, some of it's military. I think it's important that more of it is development than in the past, but that can't happen without the military, and you go round and round that loop, which all development efforts have been doing for a couple of years. Yeah, money's part of the answer, but there's been a lot of money gone in already with utterly different tactics, say in the drugs war for the past 6, 7, 8 years, and some of that is only just beginning to bear fruit.
Nick, just to go back to you for a moment, there's something you said. Is it that politics in Afghanistan has become more sophisticated, or are they more cynical in the Western sense of political cynicism?
Well, I think they're certainly cynical, more cynical than they used to be. In 2004, as I say, there was terrific optimism about the future and about what they thought democracy was going to do for Afghanistan. I think, I fear most of that has gone now. Although I think people still believe in democracy and the idea of democracy there. I mean, I think part of what made 2004 so optimistic was there was a sense of getting rid of the warlords and the past and the fighting and this terrible, bloody, chaotic past that Afghanistan had. Perhaps this coming election is going to be another step towards a better form of representative government in the future. I think it's proving more difficult than Afghans had hoped then. But perhaps it's a step forward. I'm not sure, though, that this election is going to change much on the ground in Afghanistan. Whether it's Karzai or whether it's one of the challengers that becomes president, I'm not sure that how much will change afterwards. I mean, we'll doubtless hear a lot of talk about talking to the Taliban and development and all the kinds of stuff that we've heard over and over again, but things are going to move very slowly in Afghanistan, I think, politically, and certainly for Britain. I don't think anyone can doubt that we're in for a long, perhaps almost certainly very costly haul in Afghanistan. So I don't think that much is going to change after these elections.
Well, you're nodding your head vigorously there for a moment ago.
That doesn't mean that I was agreeing, though.
But the change from 2004 to now, what's happened? What's gone wrong, if you will?
Well, what went right, probably that's the proper question, because everything went wrong according to Afghans. When you speak to Afghans, security is much worse than before. I mean, in 2004, you could have even traveled to Kandahar and Herat and God knows to areas that nobody could even think of it now. Forget about Kandahar, which is some 5 or 6 or 8 hour drive from Kabul, but now you can't go to Paghman, which is a district of Kabul and which is 15-minute drive. So things are that bad now in that sense. I would say about the campaign also, for Afghans, the issue of roads and hospitals and so on and so forth is not an issue. And probably people will be surprised here to hear that. Among 41 candidates, only one guy, who is Dr. Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai, who came out and said that he will be creating 1 million jobs. And nobody even clapped on that, well done, you're doing something differently. Or nobody's talking about jobs, nobody's talking about reconstruction. The main issue in Afghanistan for voters and for the candidates is how to bring peace and how to talk with the Taliban. And I believe this is the difference between 2004 and now. In 2004, as Nick said, that most of the people were thinking that there are warlords alongside Karzai and that government and that cabinet. With voting Karzai, probably the next cabinet will be a different cabinet, because Karzai was saying that this cabinet was imposed on him by Bonn Conference, and it's nothing to do with him. But the next cabinet will be the proper people that he wants, and people voted for that. Right now, of course, nobody talk about the warlords anymore. Everybody is worried about the Taliban, and people want a solution. I mean, I personally, when I was in Kabul, I interviewed at least 10 or 12 presidential candidates. And the main question for them and the main question for the Afghans were, how would you deal with the Taliban? And everybody was asking whether they could negotiate with the Taliban. And everybody was saying that how they will negotiate with the Taliban. Though in 2005 or 4, it was impossible. Nobody could even think about talking with the Taliban. At the time, killing Taliban was the question, not talking to Taliban. Now it is how to negotiate.
As we've heard David Miliband saying just a week ago, now we need to deal with the Taliban. And I think you're absolutely right. That's where the debate is. I wish it were about jobs. You're absolutely right. It isn't. But Ashraf Ghani, who's in many ways the ideal candidate of the West, meaning he, when does make that kind of argument, though more in print than spoken. He talks about how to create.
He talks about economy also, a lot of economy, and he got very good formulas and also a lot of ways to solve issues. But nobody listened to that.
Yeah.
I mean, when he said 1 million jobs, I was thinking that everybody will be now asking, how will you create those jobs? Who
And he
will
does,
be
it
these
seems
jobs?
to me he does have the answers for some of those things.
But nobody asked him
Yeah.
to find out whether he...
Jewelry, a fruit of textiles for women, of trying to do something about the generation educated in Pakistan and trying to improve secondary education so you actually get some teachers and lawyers. He has the answers, but you're absolutely right, the debate is not that.
Well, and where does the money come from to do all of these things, too? I mean, who's got the money to...
Today with the BBC, Dr. Abdullah was our guest in our radio program, and he was also saying that he will create a lot of jobs. Not jobs, sorry. He was saying that he will do a lot of reconstruction, and also he was focusing on those militias or mujahideens who are now, according to him, disarmed but have no jobs. So that question was put to him, that where will you get the money? And most of other candidates are also saying the same, that there's international money pouring into Afghanistan, but they are misused. So the hope is that the West will be paying for all that.
Why don't we go to the audience? Because, I mean, there's a long list of questions. I could ask corruption, Pakistan, all sorts of things. But why don't we pass the microphone
I'll say
around?
this is going to be very, very uncool. But speaking of jobs, I'm just going to go and ring my news desk. Nothing we've said.
Okay.
It's just I left the office very abruptly, and it's the nature of the train. I'll be back in 3 minutes.
Okay.
But I want to check something they do need to do.
Oh,
Thank you.
that's good.
I'll be right back.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Eleanor Randall, and I just have one or two questions to ask. It's just that you mentioned that the hospitals were not a problem, as I understood, but I think there's still really big need of hospitals, because I'm studying women in Afghanistan, and there's still really big problem with healthcare, and how could that not be an issue? Second of all, I also wonder about the election. You say that obviously the Afghan people are voting, obviously 50-50, but, well, 50% for Karzai, but what I'm thinking is I don't really, from what I've heard or what I've read, I don't think it's very democratic, because I think these people are forced into voting for probably Karzai, or it's forced voting, it's not really up to them as well. So, and it's also, I also wanted to know the foreign policy within Afghanistan, because I think the Al-Qaeda as well, they're in Pakistan as well, and the Taliban are in Pakistan as well. So what are they trying to do in Afghanistan? Is it's a special country, it's not like Iraq, it's really tribal, and everybody from Alexander the Great has not been able to get through to them. And so what are they really trying to do there? Because they don't have a clear foreign policy, they don't want to reconstruct the country, it is not helping, and the situation is worse than it ever was before. So, sorry, it's quite long.
I will leave the foreign bit to Nick.
Thanks.
You're foreign and I'm Afghan, so I will answer the Afghan bit.
All right.
I didn't say that people don't need hospitals or schools or roads, no. What I said is that people are not worried about whether they will get schools from a certain candidate or hospitals or roads. People think that these are the stuff that are going to happen. Or, I mean, nobody could ignore schools or hospitals or roads. But the main thing is that when you speak to Afghans, that they say that every day we are dying, we are losing our relatives. At that sort of a time, I'm not worried whether I will get a 5-story building for our hospital or a tent for my hospital. I'm worried about how to bring security. So that was my point about that. And the 50%, I think, I said that Afghan constitution is saying that the winner of election is the person who gets 50 plus 1 vote, so 51% vote or whatever. If nobody managed to get that sort of vote, then election will go to the second round. So if Karzai wins 49% of vote, he is not a winner, even if the second person got only 1% vote. Because there are 41 candidates, so probably the second guy will have far more less votes than the first one. So in that sense, I hope I'm clear on that.
And what about their foreign policy?
Well, on First of all, on the issues in the election, I think things like healthcare, of course, there are issues, and Afghans do, they are interested in things like healthcare and jobs, but the situation in the south in particular is, in many places, is so bad. There's so much bloodshed, and there's so much killing, and there's so much fear, that really security is the only issue. If you're afraid that bandits are going to come into your house, or the Taliban's going to take over your village, or NATO's going to bomb your village, the only thing you're worried about really is security. And when you talk to people in the south, I haven't been to the south for about a year or so, but the last time I was there, this is the thing that they talk about all the time. This is the thing that Afghans are desperate for security. So, it's not like a normal election, it's not like normal politics, although people might be interested in healthcare, security really is the thing that they're obsessed about. And actually on healthcare, I have seen some improvements. I know the hospital in Kandahar used to be an appalling place. You went in there, it stank, it was filthy. You felt sorry for anyone who was sent in there. It's been cleaned up, and it's actually not, last time I was there a year ago, it was improved massively, and we mustn't become too despondent about Afghanistan for all the problems there are in Afghanistan. There have been a lot of improvements to people's lives, things like education and healthcare. I mean, it was starting from such a terribly low level 10 years ago when the Taliban were there, and for years after that. There's still an awfully long way to go, but there have been improvements in recent years, and we mustn't forget that. Your point on foreign policy and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban being in Pakistan, yes, that's a very interesting one. I think in Helmand in particular, I think there's very little sign of Al-Qaeda being in Helmand. I've met very few British soldiers who think there are Al-Qaeda or foreign fighters in Helmand. The American soldiers think there are foreign fighters in places like Kunar and Khost along the Pakistan border. But yes, there aren't that many. There's very little sign, I think, of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. What you do hear from soldiers is the idea of Al-Qaeda training camps, Al-Qaeda teaching the Taliban how to make bombs, teaching them how to brainwash and prepare suicide bombers. And of course, Al-Qaeda has a very good base in Pakistan. The base in Waziristan is one that NATO can't reach. I mean, we can send drones and kill Al-Qaeda commanders sometimes kill civilians as well, of course, but you can't send soldiers across the border, and that's one of the reasons why this is such a difficult war to fight. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have got sanctuaries in Waziristan and probably in Quetta as well. And of course there's terrific friction between Afghanistan and Pakistan over this. I don't know whether this is an aspect of the election campaign. Is it Imal? I mean, Afghans usually very critical of Pakistan. I don't know whether that's...
surprisingly, this time nobody talked about Pakistan in election. But Al-Qaeda in Helmand, for instance, yes, Al-Qaeda as Arabs are not there, but Pakistanis are fighting in Helmand. Some Arabs are active in Paktika and Paktia provinces, and you'll be surprised that sometimes they call media and saying that I'm the Al-Qaeda spokesperson, and we have done so and so. And the other surprising aspect is that then within a few minutes Taliban will call and say that no, we have done this thing. So they are not going well together. And in the east, in Kunar province, there is another group, which is the Wahhabis. They are Afghans, but they are supported by Saudi, and they're also fighting against the government and also the foreign troops. So there are three groups in that sense in Afghanistan. But Al-Qaeda in Helmand is not there, but the Pakistanis are there.
And that's a great difference from 2004, actually. The way the Taliban has become more organised in places like Kunar and Helmand. In 2004, actually, just before the election, I drove up to Kajaki and Musakala, which was quite a dangerous thing to do then, but I wouldn't even consider for a moment doing that now. The Taliban are much more powerful. They make much more dangerous bombs.
It doesn't mean that all concerns aren't there. If you think back to the 2004 Lawyer Jirga, people, even from the south, were saying things we really care about are irrigation and education and healthcare. And all right, we've got security now because we have the Taliban boiling up for 3 years. But it's not that there's other things aren't there. And I think you're right to say that there have been some improvements. Sometimes they're tiny and they flicker into the figures. And DFID has a particularly bad record of exaggerating those or firming up those figures, like on infant mortality. But the improvement is there. They're hard to measure.
And so was it the lack of focus or the change of focus to Iraq, where there was talk that fighters from Iraq are making their way into Afghanistan now? Is that the issue, that we stopped paying attention and the Taliban could?
Yes, I think there was an implicit sense of mission accomplished in Afghanistan, even though there's no banner to mark it, and the attention swung to Iraq at a very difficult point, and a difficult point for Pakistan. It was just the point when Musharraf, for all his early strengths in running Pakistan, those were enormous, began to bend the constitution, and the inevitable conflict between himself as a military dictator and the desire to see more democracy in Pakistan was beginning to come to a head. And I think particularly America's attention came right off that. Britain got more disenchanted earlier with Musharraf, and a bit with Karzai than America did, and I think was sharper on that, but much less able to do anything about it. And yeah, there were 2-3 lost years when the Taliban really rose up.
But only to blame for this focus on Iraq will not be
not
fair,
only, but
because the Afghan government also took some decisions that made ground easy for Taliban. For instance, appointing governors who are corrupt and who are warlords in a way, and police commanders who are terrible. I mean, on numerous occasions in Kandahar, people complained about police. Once I was in Presidential Palace and speaking to Karzai, and he answered the phone and spoke to the governor of Kandahar at the time. Asadullah Khalid was the governor, and he was shouting at him that what the police are doing. So that sort of situation also created the atmosphere that we are seeing it now.
Anybody else in the audience? Yes, ma'am. If you could wait for the mic, please.
I wanted to ask you, please, how much does the drug trade affect the security situation in Afghanistan, and what does the voting public think of the drug trade?
Nick?
Well, I suppose that depends on whether they grow drugs or not, really, and an awful lot of voters will grow drugs in Helmand anyway. In Helmand in particular, and the neighbouring provinces as well a bit, there is no other economy. If you're an Afghan farmer, there's no other way to make a living than growing opium. And one of the reasons why, perhaps even the main reason why the British have had so much trouble in Helmand is when our troops arrived, everyone in Helmand assumed, rightly or wrongly, well, rightly I think, that we turned up to stop their livelihood. And there was very little done for alternative livelihood. There wasn't much communication with Helmandis then, and I don't think there's very much now either, actually. And so you had the reaction that you have, and the Taliban, they make money from the drugs trade. Farmers pay a kind of tax to the Taliban to protect their fields. When fields are eradicated, farmers join the Taliban. There are lots of drugs mafias who, they don't want British troops or American troops or the Afghan army or Afghan police there, so they pay for bomb makers and probably pay the families of boys who become suicide bombers and that kind of thing. It's massively important. It's a huge complicating factor in Helmand in particular, and really it's very hard to see how the West has had any effect on the drugs trade and any ability to control it. And it also has a huge corrupting effect on Afghan politics.
Interestingly, only one candidate talked about drug issue during more than a month of campaign now. That is again Dr. Ashraf Ghani, and his formula was that he will be speaking to the West to buy other agriculture-related stuff from Afghanistan, and that will be then somehow encouraging the people to not grow poppy. So that was the only guy. So in that sense, probably people are not interested in it. But the drug in Afghanistan, somehow, allegedly, most of the police and most of the provincial officials are involved in it. So people, and also those influenced people, the people who could reach to very high level of power. So as a result, nobody talks about it.
I think it's a really interesting question, because if you think what, say, Britain has tried, and Britain was given the, or accepted, I think rather naively accepted the sort of drugs responsibility of the South. If you think of all the things Britain's tried, first paying farmers, or buying the crop off them, then abandoning that because that gave the wrong kind of incentives, then trying to stop the actual traffickers, meaning racing the 4x4s over the tracks, which Iran is good at, though it's lost a lot of people doing that, and that didn't really work. Then arguing with the Americans about whether or not to spray the crops and trying to stop the Americans doing that. And now this rather complicated, much more sophisticated kind of hearts and minds, and try and get them to grow some other crops, which is more plausible, but much harder to say whether or not it's being successful. There's kind of despair, or a kind of a despairing agnosticism, if you like, about what works. And I think you've got something here, and in bits of the States, this kind of boiling up of a question of what to do about drugs in general. You're getting it in the States because of the Mexico problem now, whether to, it seems to be the first serious debate for a long time about whether or not to legalize drugs, because other efforts have stopped. Have failed to get very far. And I think the Afghan picture has fed into that in a big way, because people just really do not know what to do about it. It seems to be there isn't really a British or American policy about drugs with each crop that comes, you get a new policy every year, but we don't know what to do.
Back there by the bar.
Hi, thanks. I'd just like to ask briefly about your views on the likely integrity of the election system itself in the context of worsening security. I actually observed both sets of elections last time round, and I just want to make one particular point about that, which was that certainly in the South, outside of provincial capitals where you had some scrutiny, my impression was that very few women voted individually. Even in Kandahar city itself, we observed distinguished elderly gentlemen coming in with playing card packs of voter cards of women and going ahead and voting on their behalf. So we would assume that without observation outside the city centre, that very, very few women actually voted personally. So I just wanted to make that as a particular point about the system itself and ask you about what your sense is on that this time round.
Roman, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. They're going to be massively corrupt, and there is going to be a lot of kind of stories of this kind, and allegations of stolen votes and so on. And I think one of the interesting questions at the moment, particularly for officials of other countries, is where you set the bar. At what level do you, this is going to sound like a very cynical answer, I don't quite mean it like that, but at what level do you say this is broadly fair and free? We can tolerate this amount of corruption or this number of deaths, whatever, and at what point do you just say this was an unsatisfactory election? And I don't mean that to be a kind of despairing thing. It clearly is going to be unsatisfactory in many, many ways. The question is on which side of the line you come down. At the end, is this a process where you're going to be able to say, yes, we can accept the result? I guess there's enough feeling still that we can, but the South is obviously one of the black holes of it. What, you've been out there more.
There was this question in Kabul that how to declare the election as legitimate. This was a question among some candidates also, and the Afghan government was also trying to say that to put that into a debate among the local media, that whether the foreign observers, if they say that everything is okay, whether that's acceptable, whether the election commission, if they announce everything is okay, that's acceptable. So that debate is still going on.
Yeah.
But what people are afraid, and also certainly the security organization within the Afghan government is afraid, is that in Iran, after the election, there was a lot of violence. People are afraid that in Afghanistan there will be even worse because people got guns. Only this weekend, one candidate's campaigner said that we have guns and we will, if our, I will not name the candidate, if our guy didn't win, we will come out and it will be worse than Iran. So that sort of talks are already going on, and people are worried that what's the gauge or the standard to make the election as legitimate?
Yeah, I think there are frightening scenarios for what may happen afterwards if the election's disputed. But I think you have to remember that in 2004 you had a lot of frightening scenarios, and people thought there were going to be assassinations and car bombs, and the Taliban was going to be disrupting everything. And in the end, it went very smoothly. So.
We're talking after the election. Back in 2004, there were 18 candidates, 17, one left at the last minute. So 17 candidates, Karzai won, and the other 16 sat together and complained for 1 or 2 days. But then American embassy went and played a major role, and everything was rosy. But this time around, I don't.
What's the criteria for the international community to accept the election results? I mean, if the government or the election commission or the observers say it was as good as it's going to be, then the U.S., the U.K., NATO are going to.
Yeah, I mean, we're not
live with
talking
that?
about an Iranian situation where after 2 hours, miraculously, with little effort, a result is declared. No, we're talking about something healthily messier than that. But I don't know. Depends what it looks like on the night.
I guess so.
I'm surprised to hear you say actually that you didn't see many women voting when.
I said they did vote in Kandahar City where there was scrutiny. But even in Kandahar City, there were men voting on their with their voter card voting on their behalf. So it was widely said to us that outside of Kandahar City, the situation would be much, much worse. If it was happening in the city centre with scrutiny and observation. I just want to make one that I don't think there will be international observation such as that because the
There will be.
It's election support, which is slightly different to make the distinction. It's a technical support team from the OSCE and I think the EU as well,
Observers
which don't actually, what that means is they don't have the ability to go out and actually observe the proportion of polling stations which will enable them to actually say the elections are free or fair or not, which is what a proper observation is. It's something else. It's in the team at the moment, it was a technical support mission. So they will say things, but they won't validate whether it's free and fair or not.
Well, I think what's clear in these elections is logistically they're going to be hugely difficult. I mean, half the country's at war. Half the country pretty much is controlled by the Taliban. I mean, it could be. I suppose in a lot of places people will only vote if the Taliban allow them. If the people want to vote, then I suppose the Taliban will allow them. How are observers going to check this election in all those places that are really, really insecure? I think the sort of UN election experts and all the international people who are in Kabul are having a very difficult time trying to organise everything at the moment, and there must be real concerns about the logistics of how the whole thing works.
On the other, if you're wanting more cheerful examples, all right, different country, but Pakistan, the elections went surprisingly well. It's a completely different country, but it is an example that is sitting right there next to them.
There are 29,000 polling stations, and a few of candidates told me that they cannot afford to have somebody standing in each and every polling station. So for observers, it's also impossible.
Well, also, certainly last time, people really, really wanted to vote. They were so keen to go out and vote, and I think it's perhaps that will make it. Perhaps I'm being naive, but perhaps that will make it more difficult to have fraud and to, capture polling stations and that kind of thing, and for intimidation. So, I mean, I don't think anyone thinks this election's going to be perfect. There'll be all kinds of troubles with it, but perhaps if people really want to vote, then perhaps it will go okay. Fingers crossed.
Sir, did you still have the mic up here?
Thank you. Where to start? I thought it was a gross oversimplification to talk about three groups: Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the Wahhabis. And particularly when talking about the Taliban, you keep referring to the Taliban controlling large parts of Afghanistan. They don't. I mean, it's a lot of warlords and all the drug mafias that you mentioned. You can't lump them all in together as the Taliban. And it's by doing so that you don't actually understand what the real problem is or how to deal with the problem. They're very different parties with very different interests, and one has to deal with each one by one. But when talking about the elections, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what the international community thinks about the elections, it's what the Afghans think about the elections. And I'm not so sure I have quite the same optimism as yourself. I think you're right that it'll probably go to a second vote. Now, we've got ISAF and the American forces in there preparing for the election that's coming up. Are they then going to hang around and do another drive in a month and a half's time to prepare for the second vote? That I think is going to be a difficult question. And final point I want to make is about the warlords. The government has already got the warlords in there. I mean, we've got General Dostum sitting, I don't know if he's still sitting cooling his heels in Turkey, but he certainly was a few days ago. Is he really not going to be in government? I don't believe it. I think he is going to come back in some way into government. And as long as
the government.
No, but I mean after the election. If people like him remain in government, you're not going to get any serious change, and you're not really going to get the Taliban defeated, because the Taliban are drawing their support, as they always have done, because of this warlordism.
So where do you begin?
Well, I agree with the warlord bit, but on the coming to the first point, yes, there are other groups also, like Hizb Islami of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. They're also active, especially in Nuristan and Kunar provinces. But when I say those three groups, they are the main groups who are taking the bulk of whatever. And also they are the guys who are always claiming for whatever happens. In the northern Kunduz province, for instance, probably there were 5% Taliban, but 95% others who are now also called Taliban are those who are probably criminals, those who had no other thing to do, those who are former mujahideens with guns and now they don't have guns, so went back to the guns. So there's so many people, but the umbrella is Taliban. When they do something, they claim to be Taliban. So in that sense, one has to call them.
But what they claim is not relevant. It's what they actually are.
But
I mean, anybody can claim to be Taliban. That doesn't mean
And why would they claim the umbrella Taliban? I mean, why don't they stand up and say, I'm so-and-so from...
Well, I mean, you're right. Of course, there are lots of different groups, and in Helmand, it's about drug mafias play a big part, and often they have a loose allegiance to the Taliban, whereas in Kunar, they might be part of Hizb Islami, and it's in part it's journalistic shorthand to describe them as the Taliban, because I can't sort of go over every single different group that's causing problems and insecurity, and a lot of it's banditry, bandits who call themselves Taliban to scare people. But I think it's clear that there is a Taliban movement. If the West pulled out, no doubt they'd all fight each other, and that's happened before in Afghanistan's past. But I think as this war's gone on, it seems that the Taliban has become better disciplined. It's the groups are more joined up. They seem to be suddenly becoming much more effective at fighting, and Yes, there is a Taliban movement, and it seems, from what we know of it, and our understanding of it as outsiders is murky, I think. It seems that it is led more or less by Mullah Omar from Quetta. That doesn't mean that it's a well-disciplined force, but most of the fighters are pretty much on side, and they want pretty much, imposition of Sharia and get rid of foreigners. No, there are lots of different views. I mean, some of them might be, and I think this is very important to try and work out what the Taliban is and what the Taliban wants. Some of them might be pretty much signed up to Al-Qaeda by now, and I think there's a lot of evidence that a lot of these Afghan fighters who call themselves Taliban have, over the years, become much more anti-Western than they were. Others are just village guys who don't like having Western soldiers around. So it's a loose organisation, I think.
Ronan, is that? Oh, I'm sorry, Nick. No, I was going to say, is that what is that what we're facing, though? That if the West does pull out after the election, whenever it might be, that they're just going to go back to where they were 10, 20, 50y years ago?
Well, who knows? I mean, you just can't crystal ball gaze.
Loads of them are under 25. I mean, it's most of the country's under 20. It's hard to. I don't think the West is going to pull out after these elections at all. In fact, the Americans are just pitching up now in strength.
It depends.
We all know what you're saying. At the same time, you say as well that the Taliban do define themselves. People choose to say they're part of it for a particular purpose, and then go back to ordinary life. And in Pakistan, you see, I mean, several groups, which are separate bits of the Taliban, but all working to a pretty defined purpose, as we saw in Swat Valley. But they're not all the same people.
Why don't we try and get another question?
Just another thing on the Taliban. What you hear a lot in Kandahar and Lashkar, especially from Afghans, tribal leaders, people who are generally anti-Taliban, is that over time the Taliban has become more extreme. The younger recruits are perhaps a bit more sympathetic to Al-Qaeda than they would have been in the past. Mostly, I suppose you could describe them as Pashtun nationalists. But what you hear again and again is that they're more hardline than they used to be. They're much more anti-foreign than they used to be. And I think that frightens a lot of Afghans in the south. This idea of the Taliban taking over again, especially the cities, that's something that they really fear, I think.
My question is, in the last few months or in the last year, Karzai seems to be adopting more controversial and undemocratic policies, such as, the legalization of husbands allowing to rape their wives. And I'm wondering, is this merely for him to garner support in the more extremist and conservative areas of Afghanistan, or will this be a recurring theme in if he becomes elected as the president in the next regime?
Well, first of all, that law has not been approved, by the way, so wives are safe. So that was a Shiite law, and the Shiites currently are supporting Karzai. So it was a political move to get their vote in a way. And about Karzai, one thing which is famous, that most of the time he signs things without reading it. So, which later on he admitted.
And then said he hadn't read that.
Yeah, he admits that. So, but in the past few months, rather in the past 1 year, most of the actions by the Afghan government was towards the election, to gain votes. But that, I don't think, means that Karzai believes in that. Karzai is a very liberal person, I know him from a long time. He's not what he's doing, let's put it that way. But I think the situation in Afghanistan and all those stuff that he is supposed to do for so many reasons Americans also, and local warlords and local politics also are forcing him to do stuff.
He's always been capable of giving unexpected jolts, though. I remember the must be the 2002 State of the Union address that Bush gave, and had Karzai over as guest, and he was there in the balcony at Congress, and everyone cheering. And it was either the next day or the one after that he gave us a talk. I think it was at Georgetown University, and it was in Washington. And someone asked, "You would be in favour of cutting off hands as a punishment?" And he said, "Oh yes, unless the person, I forgive me, whether the person is rich enough or poor enough." There was a very peculiar qualification to this, which is not relevant to this anecdote. But and then the whole audience went, "This wasn't the hero they thought they were welcoming a couple of nights before," and then that it didn't happen. He does have a tendency to say yes to the last people who've been in the room, and that seems to be what happened with the marital law. And then I think it was some of the Hazara Shias came back and said, no, we don't want that, and then he rode back on it.
Other people complained and international pressure, and then he realized that what has happened. So
yes.
He's capable of being quite a populist as well. You see quite often he attacks America and Britain. He likes bashing Britain, actually. And that plays quite well with a lot of Afghans. You know, the frustration at the way things have gone, and at the war, and the warlords, and the power of the warlords, and all that kind of thing. He likes to find his issues sometimes, and sometimes he seems to fire from the hip a bit, I think.
Well, he shot Paddy Ashton.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. Two different questions, really. You've now talked about Pakistan a little bit. Is Pakistan playing any sort of role in these elections? From a distance, Pakistan government is perceived as weak, can't control a lot of its own sort of territory. Does it have any role to play? The second question, a UK parliamentary select committee has in the last few days published a sort of report. In very broad summary, what they seem to be saying is that there's been quite serious mission creep. You know, we went there first, we're going to construct this fantastic democratic Afghanistan. Now it seems the select committee is complaining. They're doing everything. They think they can develop, put in a development program. They can deal with the drugs issue. They can do almost everything. The parliamentarians are asking, but the thing that they don't seem to be doing is controlling the violence in places like Helmand. And really what they've said is it would be very much better if the British forces weren't doing all these things, if they left looking after the drugs and the puppies to the Afghans and the development programs, and they concentrated on the security. Because now it seems the British aims, as far as one can understand them, and the committee seems to think, is that the British aim in Afghanistan is to stop the Taliban blowing things, or somebody blowing things up in the UK. What do you understand the British mission is as part of NATO in Afghanistan? And does the Pakistan government play any role in these elections?
Do you want to start with the mission?
Both very, very, very good questions. Do you mind if I start with the Pakistan, but I will answer both. Pakistan is not directly involved, but the thing that it does that is most sensitive in Pakistan and Afghanistan is how much encouragement it gives to the American drone attacks, or that whole business. And I think we have to, and again, I don't mean to sound cynical, but I think we have to assume, and it's not a big assumption, that the Pakistan government is giving tacit support to these American attacks, albeit with very noisy protests, which it needs for cover. But officials on all sides are really very straightforward about this. In private, people just don't say it in public, that it is convenient to the Pakistan government for these strikes to happen, provided the level of civilian casualties is lower than it was some months ago. So it could have perhaps reined back on that if it had thought that this was going to be very explosive, very helpful to the Taliban in these elections, but it hasn't done that, it seems to me. So it's chosen to just keep straight on course. That seems it doesn't have much more direct, it seems to be much more direct influence than what it does on the border, which is going to be the most sensitive Afghan issue. On your other point about mission creep, no one expected the mission to be that big, apart from the many people who argued it, that it was likely to be, but it didn't seem for the first few years that it was going to be. So I think the Parliamentary Committee is absolutely right to say that the mission grew and grew. But the resources were also tiny compared to the task. A fifth of the troops, a fifth of the military resources, roughly, I think, that went into Iraq. I'm doing it on the top of my head, but it's the same number of people, roughly, and a bigger territory than Iraq, I think. And yet the number of military forces much smaller. The amount of development aid much smaller again, proportionately. So it's had a fraction of the attention that Iraq has had, and inevitably is overstretched. And as to what the role of British forces is now, I think the attempt to redefine that is sensible, but it's not that simple, is it? Because you can't really just quell the violence without beginning to address some of the other problems about whether the country is governable, because the aim isn't just to get rid of the Al-Qaeda, it is to leave a country that is governable enough by someone not to make it a safe haven for terrorists. And that isn't a trivial project.
Is that doable, Nick?
Well, on this issue of what the British mission is, I think it seems to change, doesn't it, year by year. I mean, a few years ago it seemed to be about rights and women's rights and democracy, and you heard a lot of very stirring rhetoric. Then it became much more narcotics, and I think when the British went to Helmand, it was envisaged in the early stages as being a sort of security project to assist Afghans destroying poppy fields, and it was seen very much as a sort of counter-narcotics project. Then, of course, it became this terrific fight against the Taliban, and I think it's you speak to people. I speak to people in this country when I've come back from Afghanistan. You go to pubs or family gatherings, and people ask me, "Well, what are we doing in Afghanistan?" And I think it's difficult to explain sometimes. And when you talk to soldiers on the ground, they say it's about keeping Al-Qaeda out and stopping Al-Qaeda from having a safe haven in Afghanistan. But I think that's a difficult thing to explain to people, especially because Al-Qaeda's got this fantastic safe haven in Pakistan, which is almost untouched, and there isn't that much Al-Qaeda presence anyway in Afghanistan. So I think people in this country are confused about what the mission is. I think the politicians seem to sort of at least they change the rhetoric every few years. I think Afghans are often a bit confused about it as well, and I think this is a problem because if Britain's going to stay and fight this war with the Americans, as it looks as if it is, I don't think the politicians have done a very good job, or even the army's done that good a job of explaining why we're there. And when they do explain it to you, it's in this idea of keeping Al-Qaeda out. I just think that's a difficult sell.
Nick, I will disagree on the last point of the Afghans. Afghans would like to have foreign troops, whether they're British, American, or Bengali, whoever they are, as long as there are some foreign troops in Afghanistan, because they're afraid of warlords to start with. So they definitely want foreign troops. With the British troops, the problem with the British troop was that before they going to Helmand, there were 165 American soldiers in Helmand. And that was a group called PRT, or the Provincial Reconstruction Team. All over the country, there are groups that different countries are looking after it. That provincial reconstruction team of Americans, 165 American soldiers, they done a lot of reconstruction work in Helmand. And also at the time, there was less fighting. Probably one of the reasons was that because there was less target for the Taliban to attack, so only 165 people could hide somewhere. Or probably the fighting was not as hot as later on. When the British troops went there, they were also in the number, to start with 4,000 or 5,000 of them were there. And also the British politician was saying that we are also looking after the drug issue and we will be destroying it and so on and so forth. That raised some problem in Helmand for them. But then what they started that nobody knows in Britain about it is that the British troops were paying local Helmand radios and they were advertising that the British troops are here only to fight against Taliban. We have nothing to do with your poppy. We have nothing to do with whatever you do. So please do understand. This is the ad that they broadcasted for a while. And then media, especially BBC, picked it and they apologized and they stopped it. So to come back to the role of the British troops there, unluckily before them there were Americans doing a very good job. And secondly, because there were a large number, attacks the target was easy. And thirdly, this narcotics issue also made it.
May I just say, you think me ridiculously idealistic, but I'd be sorry as everyone gets much more practical and a bit desperate about the mission if some of those early idealistic objectives were completely jettisoned, and particularly women's rights. It's a ghastly place to be a woman, if only because of how likely you are to die in pregnancy and childbirth, and how difficult to get an education. And I wouldn't ever suggest it should be the main purpose, but the longer the troops are there, the more help there may be as a side effect in beginning to get the schools open and so on.
If I can just say, I agree with you, Amal, about Afghans wanting foreign troops to be in Afghanistan, in Kabul and in the north. In Kabul in particular, there's a terrible fear of civil war because Kabul suffered so badly in the civil war in the 1990s. But I think in the south, it's much more complicated than that. I spent quite a bit of time in the south about a year ago. I hadn't been there for about 2 or 3 years. And my impression was that there's not that much support for the Taliban. People kept saying again and again it was perhaps 1 in 10 supported the Taliban. But there's also not that much support for NATO. People were really angry with NATO. They were angry that NATO hadn't brought the security that they hoped for. They were angry that NATO was bombing villages and killing people accidentally again and again. It's a very confused and fearful place in the south, and I think NATO troops have done a poor job with hearts and minds, sometimes in just communicating their message. I mean, often the Taliban are actually better at communicating their message than NATO is. It just doesn't talk to Afghan journalists, and NATO press officers don't speak to people. Soldiers on the ground do a great job of going out to villages and meeting Afghans and having tea with them and often winning them over, but they're only going to ever meet a small fraction of the people there. And I think NATO has a really tough job of winning hearts and minds of people in the south.
In the south, people are not happy with the tactics of NATO or American troops, but they will still love to have them somewhere, probably in an airport that nobody sees them. They want them to be there.
I think that's true, but the problem is in a lot of villages especially, they have a choice between the Taliban and NATO, and they'll choose whoever will bring them security. And there are so few NATO troops in the south that often they'll choose the Taliban.
Ashley, we go to the gentleman back here.
First of all, today's paper reports Bill Rammell, the Minister for Armed Forces. He says, we are fighting the insurgents now in Afghanistan because the return of the hardcore, irreconcilable Taliban would give Al-Qaeda greater freedom to operate. But he goes on later on, But let me be clear, we are not in Afghanistan because girls are not allowed to go to school. But helping them to do so is an important down payment to Afghans who are desperate for a better future for their children. Now that's the current government official position. I would have thought it was pretty unsatisfactory myself, but I'm not going to pursue that point. My questions, Taliban and the drugs. Am I not right in thinking that when Taliban were in power in the past, they were opposed to the production of the poppy and the opium, and in fact were very successful in suppressing that? Whatever else they did or didn't do, that was one thing that they succeeded in. And since they are now, we gather, getting a great deal of their resources from it, what's actually the cause of that change, apart from the obvious materialistic one, but the sort of basic Islamic principles which were involved at the previous time. Another point, if the troops left, and I think they should leave, I was opposed to the attack on Afghanistan in the first place. I believed that the 9/11 was a crime, not an act of war, and therefore there were options under international law that could be taken forward on that. However, we've got the situation now, the troops are there, and if they withdrew, yes, there would be all these different groups. But where do they all get their arms from, which enables them to have these fights? And in particular, where do they get the ammunition from? Because we know that there are countless millions of AK-47s and other small arms around the place, and they're easy to get hold of. But even an AK-47 isn't much use without ammunition. And that they need a constant supply of ammunition. It isn't that the same thing as the actual weapon. The United Nations has agreed in principle to an arms trade treaty. It's a pretty feeble treaty as it stands at the moment. It hasn't actually come into operation anyway, but it's pretty feeble even so when it does come in. But could not that be strengthened up internationally much more, in particular, to stop the flow of ammunition?
I'm not sure that there is a flow of ammunition, really. There's so much weaponry around from the war in the 80s, the Soviet war. Soviets sent huge numbers of weapons to Afghanistan, and so did the West, of course. I mean, armed the Mujahideen. And every Afghan warlord, big or small, has his little cache of AK-47s and rockets that have been buried for years and years. I'm not sure that much new weaponry is getting into Afghanistan, actually. I'm sure some is from Pakistan.
I mean, there's not a problem bringing it in from Pakistan. And the Russians.
Coming.
Well, whatever. There's just so much of this stuff there from the 80s war. If you go out on the ground, if you go on embeds with soldiers, they're forever digging up caches of weaponry. Everyone's got piles of weapons buried out of the back of the house. And so it's one reason why the place is such a terrific problem. It's just awash with weapons.
Yeah, but specifically the ammunition, because ammunition is still being produced. I saw a statistic recently. Enough bullets were produced in a year to kill every man, woman, and child on Earth twice.
Nimal, what?
Well, in Afghanistan, if the foreign troops leave Afghanistan, what will happen? That has already happened in between 92 and 96, or even up to 2001. A proxy war will start there. Our neighbors, Afghan neighbors, Iran and Pakistan to start with, they will be helping certain groups because of their own influence there. So weapon will be coming like a river. So that's not a problem, apart from what there is already in Afghanistan. But Iran and Pakistan will supply a lot of their so-called friends. So the war will start and weapon will be definitely there. On the Taliban bit of the drugs bit, the poppy, yes, in the last year of their power in 2001, and 2001, Mullah Omar issued a decree and banned poppy. And with one decree, it was banned properly. And people were afraid because the good thing about Taliban was that whatever they said, they implemented it, and nobody could do anything about it. So it was stopped. But now, when you speak to the Taliban, they say that the drug is going to the West, and the West is our enemy. So why bother with it?
And isn't part of the issue with the ammunition too that the groups that the West is working with are happily taking supplies from the West and happily selling them on to the bad guys, and then coming back and saying, "Please give us some more, because we're out." I mean, so again, the corruption is a huge factor in that too, wouldn't it be?
Well, if the West is leaving, then the weapon will be, of course, with the Afghan army. Back in 1992, when the communist government collapsed, the Afghan army was very strong at the time. They had gotten nearly 1 million soldiers and a lot of weapons at the time. But what happened? Each group, wherever they went, the army just handed over their weapons and all stuff. Now if the West leave, of course, Afghan army will have the weapon, but the army then will go to their own groups. So the weapon, even if it is a Western weapon, it will go to certain groups.
I think we can do one more, couple more, one more. Okay.
I want to talk about talking with Taliban. I mean, the U.S. new strategy is talking with Taliban. Britain joined the same track. Obviously, the Afghani government is talking about the same issue. This is the title of this election, obviously. So what do you think? I mean, which one of the three main candidates, Karzai, Abdullah, and Ghani, will be the proper one to do this mission? Regarding which kind of resources he has, the tribe issue, maybe other factors, each candidate is going to do this mission. And I want to talk about the role of international committee in this election. We mentioned about the Pakistani one, but I mean, I read that the foreign troops, US troops and British troops, will be low profile working during this election procedure just to put away the role of US and UK in this election. So what kind of role could be? I don't know, supporting Karzai or supporting another candidates?
Okay, shall I go with that? On the supporting bit, openly they say that we are not supporting anyone, so God knows what happened behind the scene. But the first...
Asking about the behind scene.
Well, Nick, you answer the behind the scene.
Well, it's difficult in Afghanistan to work out what's going on behind the scenes. A lot of people try to. I don't think... I'm not sure that the Americans are really supporting any candidate. They were pretty keen to get rid of Karzai. I think in the past, it seems now they accept that perhaps we're all stuck with him. I don't know. I think they've been fairly careful, actually, not to back any particular candidate and to try and stay out of this contest. Your point about talking to the Taliban. It seems to me that every time Afghanistan flares up as a political issue in Britain and there's a bit of despair about Afghanistan, we hear this thing about talking to the Taliban, and it's touted as a sort of an exit strategy from Afghanistan. I have no idea how it could work. I have no idea how any deal could be done with Mullah Omar, who's pretty extreme and is pretty close to Al-Qaeda. I don't know whether Mullah Omar could somehow renounce that and become a minister in the government or something like that. I don't know. Perhaps it's possible, but I think it's very hard to see how it could happen. And I think apart from that, who are you going to talk to? Because it seems that Mullah Omar is more or less in control of the Taliban movement. No doubt there are small warlords who can be peeled away, and that's happened a fair bit. It's classic counterinsurgency, actually, to try and win over your enemies. And I'm sure this policy of talking to the Taliban will be effective in sowing discord in the Taliban's ranks and perhaps in weakening them. But for me, it's very hard to see how this can ever be an exit strategy or a way of making peace. And even if it could be done, you've got the Northern Alliance, or what was the Northern Alliance, and the Tajiks who hate the Taliban. And if they were to come into government somehow, I don't know how that could be done without going back to civil war.
Yeah, but
I'm not sure it is British government policy in any sense. David Miliband said, he made a speech saying he thought it was a good idea, that kind of keynote speech. But Gordon Brown had said almost the opposite about 3 days before. And I'm not sure it was really echoed in the Bill Rammell comments at all. I don't think you've got a united position there. And so, given what Britain's appalled response to the Pakistan government's deal with the Taliban in the Swat Valley earlier this year, it seems to me really not straightforwardly British government position. And anyway, you wouldn't want to try and do a deal with your enemy at a point when the enemy thinks he's ascendant, which the Taliban do at the moment. You want to do it at the point when you're in a position to set the terms. On the other hand, everyone is aware of those moments when you suddenly want to find yourself talking to the people who had been enemies. There is all the talk at the moment, quite seriously, about how to bring Hamas into some kind of talks, possibly even eventually with Israel. There was the Northern Ireland example shining away there, though people argue quite rightly about its relevance. So it's a proper kind of discussion to have, but I don't think it's British government policy.
I think the question was about the three candidates. Dr. Abdullah is one of the guys who was fighting Taliban. So he is somehow out of question, but he is openly saying that he will be trying to negotiate with the Taliban now. Karzai and his team is, for the past year or two, are talking. In fact, on 16th of July or 17th of July, Karzai's brother, Qayyum Karzai, went to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to talk with the Taliban. So behind the scene I know. They talk even now in Saudi and other places. And Ashraf Ghani, he says that the other day he was explaining his strategy, that he has a strategy of a few steps. The first step is that within 3 years, there has to be a ceasefire in Afghanistan, and he will be negotiating with the Taliban to agree for the ceasefire through the scholars, through the tribal elders, through the different channels within the Afghan society, to convince Taliban that, okay, enough is enough, let's have a ceasefire. And the main point of the Taliban, which is the foreign troops should withdraw, he is saying that if we have 3 years of ceasefire, then we will discuss a timetable for the foreign troops. So he has some sort of a strategy that he will convince the Taliban for a ceasefire, and then there will be some sort of a negotiation with the Taliban. The main thing is that every candidate in Afghanistan, and everyone, whether he's Tajik or Hazara or Pashtun or whoever, now is convinced that without a dialogue with the Taliban, security is not going to happen. And when we talk about Taliban, there's also Hizb Islami of Hikmatyar. But the negotiation, by the way, with the Taliban is going on at the same time with the Hizb Islami is also going on. So Afghans are now ready to talk with the Taliban. The international aspect of it is a bit difficult because there's a bounty on Mullah Omar and there's a bounty on several other Taliban leaders that has to go. Meaning that Washington should be convinced, or London should be convinced, that forget about what happened in the past, let's talk to them, and then they could get somewhere. And Mullah Omar will not be in the cabinet, definitely not, but probably Taliban sympathizers or Taliban somebody might be a governor. Right now also, we have in 2 provinces former Taliban officials are governors, so that sort of thing is possible.
I can't imagine the American president who dropped the bounty on Osama bin Laden's head. It's not
they will keep
doable.
fighting them. Yeah.
Do you think Obama has got it right, or is this another quagmire? Is he going the right way with his new policies?
We don't know yet. I mean, he's decided carefully to put more troops in. He didn't take all the general's first recommendations. He thought about it. He can presumably take them out again. It seems that if it's a quagmire, I mean, not to stretch the metaphor, he's going into it with duckboards in front of it. It's careful. I don't think there's limitless support there for it at all, but there's nothing like the kind of caustic debate you've got here at the moment.
Well, I think it is a quagmire in many ways. I mean, it's a very costly, very difficult guerrilla campaign. I think there's no one thinks there's an easy exit from this. There's no clear exit strategy from it. I think everyone expects it to go on for a very long time. I suppose if you're an optimist, this incredible military colossus that is the US Army coming to Afghanistan as it has done, and the surge in the last few months could perhaps not quickly beat the Taliban, but could wear the Taliban down, could bring security to places where NATO's not had the manpower.
So the US Army has got very good at this. I mean, I think you can say fairly, some years ago, they had no feel for the development, for the hearts and minds. They have got better at that, and they have got better at the counterinsurgency.
Well, certainly had to practice recently.
Absolutely. But,
well, I think that's true, but this is such a colossal task. I mean, Afghanistan is a much more difficult country to fight a guerrilla war in than Iraq, really. I mean, it's much more, it's so less developed than Iraq. You know, you look at places like Uruzgan or Zabul, these provinces where the Taliban are in the mountains. There are no roads in half of the place. I mean, the Taliban has massive supporters. It's a huge task. The American military does seem to be absolutely determined to fight and win against the Taliban, and they're bringing far more to the battle than there was in the past. They've got far more helicopters now, far more troops on the ground. But it's a massive task they've set themselves.
Just to bring it back around to the election, because I think we're sort of running out of time here, but quickly, what has to happen with this election, do you think? 1, 2, 3.
People should vote.
Okay, but short and simple.
Well, most of the people were thinking even a few weeks ago in Kabul or other places of Afghanistan that probably election is not possible because of security and so many other things. And there were these rumors going on that probably there will be at the last minute, the politician will decide that, okay, security is so bad that we cannot hold election, let's have for 2 years a transition government, and main candidates might run a government. But I think election will happen.
Well, I suppose if Afghanistan gets through this election in the aftermath without a disaster, everyone will be happy. If there's huge turmoil and protests in the streets, then that will be another disaster for Afghanistan, I suppose. So I'm not sure that much is going to change politically after the election. I'm not sure the expectations are that high that there'll be any big change on the ground, really.
Brown,
so mainly it has to happen. I think there's a big step back.
I think that's it. One more.
Can I ask one?
Make one point which I think is very important. And it's about women's rights. You mentioned the position of women in Afghanistan being ghastly, which I think certainly from our perspective, we do think it's ghastly. From the average Afghan woman's perspective, they're resigned to it. Most of them don't think it's ghastly in the sense that we think of it. I mean, I think the sort of comments that were made about rape within marriage, again, sound to us ghastly, but I can think back 30 years, there isn't a single judge in this country who would have convicted somebody of rape within a marital relationship. So, it's not, let's not be hypocritical.
I'm not talking about rape within marriage, I'm talking about death within childbirth.
I understand.
Most people think.
I understand it. But my point is that it's certainly in terms of female education, I think we're making a very big mistake because the principal problem is not female education, it's male education. It's the males who have to be educated, and by taking this position on, particularly on female education, but also on other female issues, we're creating a barrier within society that's going to be very difficult to reconcile. Not only have we got a problem with Taliban, but we're also going to have a problem between male and female within society. You're going to have a female population growing up that's going to be better educated than the male population, that's going to have ideas about certain aspects of society that the males will not have. Unless you're educating both together in the same way, you're going to create much bigger problems, much bigger than anything the Taliban are going to be confronting you with.
But it is a long debate. But I don't agree, if only because even more money has gone into primary schools for boys as well. I mean, it's part of the whole drive. I hope there's a big problem in Afghanistan of not concentrating at all on secondary education, so you're not going to get teachers and doctors and lawyers and everything. But I don't agree with you, and we could continue it at some length. And it doesn't seem to me what Afghan women say either when they begin to put words to it, and they do put a lot of words to it.
The change. Afghan women are different women that were a few years back.
Yeah.
I mean, people in the parliament, I mean, there are some parliamentarians who were not happy to speak to women, and yet now they are sitting next to each other, and
there has been a lot of change. There's been a health minister who was extremely good, a treasury minister who was excellent and respected by the men. I think there have been big steps. But still, and those women are immensely articulate about wanting more health and education for women of Afghanistan. But you just take the bald statistics of health and then, if you like, education, and it's a rough place, second from the bottom.
Nick, do you have a quick last word on this?
Well, just the comments about earlier about the MPs committee and the idea that mission creep, and we've been trying to do too many things. We should concentrate on security. I think it's a bit concerning that Britain has achieved quite a lot in Afghanistan in things like women's rights and education, and that's really important. And one of the reasons why it's important is because in fighting, this war isn't simply about military matters. It's about winning over, the hearts and minds of Afghans and supporting our friends in Afghanistan who want some kind of democracy and a modern society. And perhaps years ago, all the stuff about the burqas was a bit overblown by some politicians. But I think the West and the international community has achieved quite a lot, actually, in supporting women's rights and education in Afghanistan. It's really important that we continue to do that.
Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you.